The elegant cream envelope sat on Margaret Sullivan's kitchen counter like a bomb waiting to detonate. She'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, coffee growing cold beside her trembling hand. The wedding invitation she'd been expecting for months had finally arrived, but when she'd slid out the heavy cardstock and gold foil announcement, her name was nowhere to be found. Just Mr. James Sullivan and guest, as if 43 years of marriage had rendered her nothing more than her husband's anonymous +1. Margaret ran her finger over the embossed lettering one more time, feeling the slight depression where her name should have been. The oversight couldn't be accidental. Not with Vivian Richardson handling the invitations. That woman had been trying to erase Margaret from Willowbrook's social scene for nearly 3 decades. The kitchen phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Margaret cleared her throat before answering. "Hello? Did you get it?" Her daughter Emily's voice bubbled with excitement. "The wedding invitation for the Chambers, Richardson wedding? It just came today, and Mom, it's gorgeous. I can't believe Charlotte Richardson is finally settling down. Remember how wild she was in high school?" Margaret's throat tightened. "Yes, I received it this morning." "And what do you think? Worth the wait, right? Gold foil and everything. Vivian Richardson certainly doesn't do anything halfway." "Emily, my name isn't on it." The words came out flatter than she intended. "What do you mean?" "The invitation. It's addressed only to your father and guest, not Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, just your father, as if I don't exist." A pause stretched between them. "Oh, Mom, I'm sure it was just an oversight. You know how hectic wedding planning can be." "Vivian Richardson doesn't make oversights, not when it comes to social slights." Margaret took a steadying breath. This was deliberate. "Mom, really, that feud between you two was ages ago. I'm sure she's forgotten all about it by now." Margaret almost laughed. Forgotten? Vivian Richardson had the memory of an elephant and the grudge-holding capacity to match. The woman had been punishing Margaret ever since the Willowbrook Historical Society fundraiser of 1997, when Margaret had been elected president instead of her. 28 years of subtle undermining, backhanded compliments, and strategic exclusions followed, culminating in this latest slight. "It's not important," Margaret lied, suddenly tired of explaining herself. "How are the boys?" The conversation shifted to grandchildren and school activities, but Margaret's mind kept returning to the invitation. After hanging up, she picked it up again, studying it as if it might reveal some hidden message. The wedding was being held at Meadowview, the historic estate that Margaret had helped save from developers back when she led the Historical Society. The irony wasn't lost on her. The sound of the garage door opening announced James's return from his golf game. Margaret quickly slid the invitation back into its envelope and placed it beside his chair. She busied herself making a fresh pot of coffee, her movements mechanical. "Beautiful day out there," James announced as he entered, dropping his car keys on the counter. "Tommy Robertson was telling me they finally got an offer on their house. After 6 months on the market, can you believe it?" Margaret handed him a mug of coffee, forcing a smile. "That's nice, dear." "Nice? It's fantastic. We've been trying to help them sell that place forever. And get this," he leaned in conspiratorially, "it's over asking price." Some developer from Chicago apparently fell in love with the location. This actually caught Margaret's attention. Developer? What are they planning to do with it? James shrugged. "Tear it down, I imagine. Build something modern. That's what these out-of-town types usually do." The Robertson House, an original craftsman on Maple Street, built in 1923, one of the few remaining architectural treasures in the neighborhood. The thought of it being demolished made Margaret's stomach clench. "Anyway," James continued, "Tommy invited us to celebrate at their place tonight. Just a small gathering. You don't mind, do you?" Before Margaret could respond, James spotted the envelope. Is this what I think it is? He picked it up, excitement evident in his voice. Finally! The Richardson girls' wedding invitation. Vivian has been talking about nothing else at the club for months. Margaret watched silently as he opened it, her eyes fixed on his face, waiting for the moment of realization. But it never came. James simply smiled as he read through the details. June 12th. That's not too far off. We'll need to find you something nice to wear. He placed the invitation back in the envelope, completely missing the exclusion of his wife's name. James, Margaret said quietly, look at the invitation again. Look at how it's addressed. He frowned, pulling the card back out. James Sullivan and guest, he read aloud, then looked up, confusion evident. So? So I'm not mentioned. I'm just your guest, after 43 years of marriage. James stared at the invitation, then shrugged. It's probably just an oversight, Maggie. You know how these things go. Not with Vivian Richardson. She doesn't make those kinds of mistakes. He sighed, setting the invitation down. You're not still holding on to that old rivalry, are you? That was decades ago. It's not about the rivalry, it's about respect, James. Margaret's voice remained steady even as frustration welled inside her. Vivian has been doing this for years. Excluding me from committees, forgetting to mention me in society column write-ups about charity events I organized, and now this. She's making a statement that I don't matter. You're overreacting. It's just an invitation. Margaret fell silent. Just an invitation. Just like it was just a misprint when Vivian had left Margaret's name off the Historical Society's commemorative plaque after 10 years of service. Or just an oversight when Margaret hadn't been invited to the Ladies' League 30-year membership celebration despite being a founding member. You're right, she finally said, turning back to the sink. It's not important. James looked relieved. Good. So we'll go to Tommy's tonight? 7 o'clock. Margaret nodded absently, already lost in thought. That evening, Margaret sat quietly at the Robertsons' dining table, surrounded by the jubilant conversation of neighbors celebrating the impending sale of the house. Betty Robertson was in the middle of describing the Chicago buyer. He just walked in and fell in love with the place immediately, didn't even try to negotiate, said he could see the potential right away. The potential to tear it down, you mean? Someone commented. Betty waved dismissively. Well, that's progress, isn't it? This old place has served its purpose. Time for something new. Something new where a historical treasure once stood, Margaret murmured, too quietly for anyone but her dinner companion to hear. Beside her, Henry Watkins, the retired history teacher and fellow Historical Society member, nodded solemnly. Shame about the house, he said softly. One of the last original craftsmen in the neighborhood. Do you know if the sale is final? Margaret asked. Not quite. There's still the inspection scheduled for Monday, but the buyer's agent says it's just a formality. They're planning to close by the end of the month. Margaret nodded, an idea beginning to form. Margaret, dear, Betty called from across the table, drawing her attention. Vivian was just telling me about Charlotte's wedding. Such exciting news. You must be thrilled to be invited. It's going to be the event of the season. Margaret forced a smile, aware of Vivian Richardson's sharp gaze from the other end of the table. Yes, it's wonderful news. The ceremony at Meadowview will be simply magical. Vivian interjected smoothly. We've hired the most exclusive florist from the city. The roses alone cost a small fortune, but one must maintain standards. Meadowview is the perfect venue, Margaret agreed. I'm so glad the Historical Society was able to preserve it all those years ago. A flicker of annoyance crossed Vivian's perfectly made-up face. Yes, well, that was a long time ago. The current board has made significant improvements since then. I'm sure they have, Margaret replied pleasantly, though she knew for a fact that the improvements had been largely cosmetic. while the structural preservation work her board had commissioned was what had truly saved the building. The conversation shifted, but Margaret remained aware of Vivian's eyes on her throughout the evening. As coffee and dessert were served, Margaret excused herself to use the restroom. Instead of turning toward the guest bathroom, however, she made her way upstairs to Tommy Robertson's home office. The room was dimly lit by a desk lamp, folders and papers spread across the surface. Margaret moved quietly, scanning the documents until she found what she was looking for, a folder labeled House Sale, Chicago Buyer. Inside was the inspection schedule, contact information for the buyer's agent, and copies of the preliminary paperwork. Margaret quickly took photos of the documents with her phone, her heart racing. She had never done anything like this before, but the combination of Vivian's slight and the impending destruction of a historical home had awakened something in her, a determination to no longer be overlooked or dismissed. She had just replaced the folder when a voice from the doorway startled her. "Looking for something, Margaret?" Vivian Richardson stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Margaret straightened, maintaining her composure. "Just getting some air." The dining room was a bit stuffy. "In Tommy's office? How convenient." Vivian stepped into the room. "I saw you earlier, you know. When you opened our invitation, the look on your face was quite telling." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Please, Margaret, we've known each other too long for such pretense. You noticed immediately that I hadn't included your name. That you were merely James's guest." Vivian's smile widened. "A small oversight, I assure you." "Of course," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside. "Just like all your other oversights over the years." Vivian shrugged elegantly. "You always did think you were so important to this community, the Grand Dame of Willowbrook. But times change, Margaret. New leadership takes over. Your time has passed." The words stung, but Margaret refused to show it. "If you'll excuse me, I should get back to the party." "By all means," Vivian stepped aside, but added as Margaret passed. "Do give my regards to James. He's always such a delight at the club events. We all adore him so." Margaret rejoined the gathering downstairs, maintaining her pleasant smile, though her mind was racing. By the time she and James drove home later that evening, her plan was already taking shape. The next morning, Margaret woke early. James was still sleeping as she slipped out of bed and made her way to her home office. The small room was lined with bookshelves filled with local history volumes and community organization binders, the accumulated documentation of decades of volunteer work that few people acknowledged anymore. She pulled out the folder labeled Historical Preservation, Landmark Statuses, and began reviewing the contents. Then she opened her laptop and began composing an email to her old friend Eleanor Matthews, who had served on the Willowbrook City Council for 20 years before retiring to Florida. "Eleanor," she wrote, "I hope this finds you well. I'm writing regarding an urgent matter concerning historical preservation in Willowbrook. The Robertson House on Maple Street, a 1923 craftsman that we discussed protecting years ago, is about to be sold to a developer who plans to demolish it. I believe we need to revisit the landmark designation we began processing in 2008. Do you recall where that paperwork ended up when you left office?" Margaret spent the next hour sending similar emails to former council members, historical society colleagues, and state preservation officials. By the time James wandered into the kitchen looking for coffee, she had already received 3 responses. "You're up early," he commented, pouring himself a cup. "I had some correspondence to catch up on," she replied, closing her laptop. "How did you sleep?" "Fine, fine. Say, I was thinking about the Robertson House celebration last night. You seemed a bit quiet. Everything okay?" Margaret smiled. "Everything's fine. I just had some things on my mind." "Not still bothered about that invitation, are you?" "No, James. I've moved past that. It wasn't entirely a lie. The invitation's slight had merely been the catalyst for something larger, a reclamation of her voice and influence that had been gradually eroding over the years. Good, good. James settled at the table with the morning newspaper. Tommy mentioned last night that the buyer is planning to close quickly. Apparently, he's got architects already drawing up plans for the new place. Modern glass and steel, from what Tommy described. Margaret nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Sounds interesting. Oh, and I almost forgot. We got a call from the country club last night after we left the party. The membership committee is having an emergency meeting this afternoon. Something about revising the bylaws. They need me there as past president. On a Sunday? Margaret asked. James shrugged. Apparently it can't wait. You don't mind, do you? I shouldn't be more than a couple of hours. Not at all. I have plenty to keep me busy here. As soon as James left for his meeting, Margaret went back to work. Eleanor had responded with detailed information about the landmark designation process they had begun years ago for several historic homes in Willowbrook, including the Robertson House. The process had stalled when the economic downturn had shifted priorities, but the initial research and documentation were still on file with the State Historic Preservation Office. Margaret made a series of phone calls, calling in favors from old colleagues and friends who still held positions of influence. By mid-afternoon, she had scheduled a meeting with the current Historical Society board for 7 o'clock the next morning, just before the Robertson House inspection was set to take place. When James returned from his meeting, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself. You're in a good mood, he observed, loosening his tie. It's been a productive day, she replied. How was the meeting? Tedious, as usual. Vivian was there, by the way. Asked me to remind you about the RSVP for the wedding. Apparently, they need final numbers by next Friday. Margaret stirred the sauce she was making, keeping her voice casual. I'll take care of it tomorrow. That night, Margaret lay awake long after James had fallen asleep, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. For the first time in years, she felt truly energized. Not just angry about a slight, but determined to make a difference, to remind her community that she was still a force to be reckoned with. Monday morning arrived with a steady spring rain pattering against the windows. Margaret dressed carefully in a navy suit she hadn't worn in years, her power suit from her days leading community initiatives. She applied her makeup with precision and clasped her grandmother's pearl necklace around her throat. Meeting today? James asked, surprised to see her so formally dressed at 6:30 in the morning. Historical Society emergency session, she replied. Some concerns about preservation initiatives. James raised his eyebrows but didn't question further. Well, you look nice, very official. Thank you, dear. Don't wait up for dinner, this might run late. The Historical Society board meeting was held in the small conference room of the Willowbrook Community Center. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, arranging her documentation carefully on the table before the other members arrived. Henry Watkins was the first to enter, followed by 3 other board members. All looked slightly bewildered at the urgent summons. Margaret, Henry greeted her warmly. What's this emergency about? Your message was rather cryptic. I'll explain everything once everyone's here, she assured him. By 7 o'clock, all 7 board members had arrived, including Richard Harrison, the current president, who had replaced Vivian Richardson 3 years earlier. Margaret, Richard began, checking his watch, while we all respect your contributions to the Historical Society, calling an emergency meeting without consulting me first is highly irregular. I apologize for the unconventional approach, Richard, Margaret replied calmly, but time is of the essence. The Robertson House on Maple Street is scheduled for an inspection at 8 this morning, after which the sale to a Chicago developer will move forward. the developer plans to demolish the house immediately. The Robertson house? The craftsman? Henry interjected. That's a shame, but I'm not sure what the Historical Society can do at this point. It's private property. Actually, there's quite a bit we can do. Margaret distributed folders to each board member. 17 years ago, under Eleanor Matthews' City Council leadership, we began the process of designating several historic homes in Willowbrook for landmark status. The Robertson House was among them. The process was never completed due to budget constraints, but all the preliminary research and documentation were filed with the State Historic Preservation Office. The board members began reviewing the documents with interest. According to Municipal Code Section 12.7, Margaret continued, the Historical Society can file an emergency petition for temporary landmark status when a property of significant historical value is under imminent threat. This would halt any demolition plans for 90 days while a full review is conducted. Richard frowned, flipping through the papers. This is all very interesting, Margaret, but the current board has a different approach to preservation. We've been focusing on the downtown commercial district, not private residences. I understand that, Richard, but the Robertson House represents one of the last intact examples of 1920s craftsman architecture in our community. Once it's gone forever. Margaret makes a valid point, Henry said, studying the old photographs included in the folder. This house has significant architectural value. For the next 45 minutes, Margaret presented her case, drawing on decades of knowledge about Willowbrook's architectural history and preservation law. She had prepared for every counter-argument, anticipating the board's concerns about private property rights, community resources, and potential legal challenges. By 7:50, the board was convinced. They voted unanimously to file the emergency petition, which Margaret had already prepared for their signatures. I'll take this directly to City Hall, Margaret said, gathering the signed documents. The clerk's office opens at 8. And the inspection? Henry asked. Once the petition is filed, I'll notify the Robertsons and the buyer's agent. By law, they'll have to postpone any sale pending the landmark review. As the meeting adjourned, Richard approached Margaret privately. That was quite impressive, Margaret. I had no idea you were still so involved in preservation matters. Some passions never fade, Richard. She smiled. And some of us old-timers still have a few tricks up our sleeves. By 8:15, Margaret had filed the petition at City Hall and was standing on the Robertsons' front porch as the inspector and the buyer's agent arrived. The rain had stopped, leaving the spring air fresh and clean. I'm sorry, she told them, handing copies of the filed petition to each, but this inspection will need to be postponed. The Robertson House has just been granted temporary landmark status pending review. The buyer's agent, a young woman in an expensive suit, frowned at the document. This is highly irregular. Our client has a signed purchase agreement. Subject to inspection and closing, Margaret noted. The landmark designation supersedes any pending sale when demolition is the intended outcome. Municipal code is quite clear on this matter. As they were speaking, Tommy Robertson emerged from the house, confusion evident on his face. Margaret, what's going on here? Your home has been granted temporary landmark status, Tommy, Margaret explained gently. It's being recognized for its historical and architectural significance. But the sale will need to be put on hold while the landmark review is conducted. The buyer is welcome to purchase the property, of course, but they won't be permitted to demolish it if the landmark status is confirmed. Tommy's face reddened. You can't do this, Margaret. This sale means everything to Betty and me. Our retirement depends on it. I understand your concern, Tommy, but a landmark designation typically increases property value, not decreases it, and there are tax benefits as well. She handed him a brochure she had prepared. All the information is here, including potential grants for historical property maintenance. The buyer's agent was already on her phone, presumably calling her client. The inspector stood awkwardly to the side, uncertain whether to proceed. Tommy took Margaret's arm, pulling her slightly away from the others. "Why are you doing this, Margaret? This isn't like you." Margaret looked him directly in the eyes. "Isn't it, Tommy? I've spent decades trying to preserve what's valuable in this community. Your house is part of Willowbrook's heritage. I couldn't stand by and watch it be destroyed." "This isn't about the house," Tommy said, realization dawning. "This is about something else." Before Margaret could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and Vivian Richardson emerged, her expression thunderous. "I might have known you were behind this, Margaret Sullivan," she called as she approached. "Betty called me in a panic about some ridiculous landmark nonsense." Margaret turned to face her old rival, her composure unshaken. "Not nonsense, Vivian. Legal protection for a historical treasure." Something I would have expected the former Historical Society president to understand. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "This is about the wedding invitation, isn't it? You're causing all this trouble because of a simple oversight on the guest list." The buyer's agent and inspector exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the personal confrontation unfolding before them. "This has nothing to do with your daughter's wedding," Margaret replied calmly, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "This is about preserving our community's heritage. Something I've dedicated my life to, while others have used community organizations merely as social stepping stones." Vivian's face flushed with anger. "How dare you! I've contributed more to this community in the last decade than you have in your entire life. You're nothing but a bitter old woman who can't accept that her time has passed." The words echoed Vivian's comment from the party, but this time, spoken publicly, they carried a different weight. Tommy looked shocked, and even the buyer's agent seemed taken aback by the venom in Vivian's voice. Margaret merely smiled. "If my time has truly passed, Vivian, then how do you explain this?" She held up the landmark petition with the board's unanimous approval. "It seems there are still those in Willowbrook who value my opinion and expertise." Vivian turned to Tommy. "You can fight this, you know. Challenge the petition. It's your property, your retirement at stake." Tommy looked uncertain, glancing between the two women. "I don't know, Vivian. If the house really is historically significant. It's a drafty old building that costs a fortune to heat and needs constant maintenance," Vivian snapped. "Don't let Margaret's crusade ruin your financial future." The front door opened and Betty Robertson stepped out onto the porch. "What's all this commotion? Tommy, what's happening with the inspection?" As Tommy began explaining the situation to his wife, the buyer's agent approached Margaret. "My client would like to speak with you directly, Mrs. Sullivan. He's on the phone now." Margaret took the offered phone. "This is Margaret Sullivan." A deep voice responded. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Anthony Kerrigan. I understand you've thrown a wrench into my plans for the Robertson property." "Mr. Kerrigan, I've simply initiated a process to protect a historically significant building. If you're interested in the property itself rather than just the lot, there are numerous ways to modernize the interior while preserving the historical facade." There was a pause. "I'm a developer, Mrs. Sullivan. I buy properties, tear them down, and build new ones. That's my business model." "Perhaps it's time to expand your model, Mr. Kerrigan. Historically preserved properties with modern interiors are actually commanding premium prices in many markets. It could be a lucrative new direction for your company." Another pause, longer this time. "You seem quite knowledgeable about real estate for a historical preservation enthusiast." "I've been around long enough to see many trends come and go, Mr. Kerrigan. Destruction is easy. Preservation with purpose. That's where the true challenge and reward lie." To Margaret's surprise, Kerrigan chuckled. "You remind me of my grandmother. She never backed down either." Another pause. "Tell you what, Mrs. Sullivan. I'll have my architects look into renovation options rather than demolition. If they can come up with something that preserves the historical elements while meeting my needs for a modern space, I'll consider it. That sounds like a reasonable compromise, Mr. Kerrigan. Don't get too excited. If the numbers don't work, I'll fight this landmark designation with every legal resource at my disposal. I would expect nothing less, but I think you'll find that history and progress can coexist quite profitably. Margaret ended the call and handed the phone back to the agent. Mr. Kerrigan would like you to reschedule the inspection for next week. He'll be sending revised plans that incorporate the existing structure rather than demolishing it. The agent looked surprised but nodded, making a note in her planner. Margaret turned back to the group on the porch. Vivian was still arguing with Tommy and Betty, her voice rising in frustration. The neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual Monday morning activity. "Excuse me," Margaret said, interrupting Vivian mid-sentence. "I've just spoken with Mr. Kerrigan. He's considering a renovation plan that would preserve the historical facade while modernizing the interior. The inspection will be rescheduled once those plans are developed." Betty's eyes widened. Would he still pay the same amount? "That would be between you and Mr. Kerrigan," Margaret replied. "But historically designated properties typically command higher prices, not lower ones, and there are tax incentives as well." Vivian looked as though she might explode. "This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz in and disrupt a private sale because of some misguided nostalgia for old buildings." "Actually, she can," a new voice interjected. Everyone turned to see Henry Watkins approaching from the street, several other Historical Society board members behind him. The petition was filed legally and approved unanimously by the board. The process will move forward according to municipal code. Vivian glared at the group, then at Margaret. "This isn't over, Margaret, not by a long shot." She turned and stalked back to her car, heels clicking sharply on the wet pavement. As the crowd began to disperse, Tommy pulled Margaret aside. "I'm still not happy about this surprise, Margaret. But if this developer is willing to pay a fair price and preserve the house's character, well, Betty always did love the original woodwork." Margaret patted his arm. "Trust me, Tommy. This could turn out better for everyone involved." By noon, word of the morning's events had spread throughout Willowbrook. Margaret received a dozen phone calls from old friends and acquaintances, some congratulating her on her quick action, others questioning her interference in a private sale. She answered each call with the same calm assurance, explaining the historical significance of the Robertson house and the importance of preserving the community's architectural heritage. James called around 1 o'clock. "Maggie, what's this I'm hearing about you stopping the Robertson house sale?" Tommy's wife called the club manager in tears. "I didn't stop the sale, James. I simply ensured that any new owner would have to preserve the historical elements of the house. The buyer is already considering renovation plans instead of demolition." A long pause followed. "This is about that wedding invitation, isn't it? You're getting back at Vivian." Margaret sighed. "It's about much more than that, James. It's about standing up for what matters. The invitation was just the final straw." "People are talking, Maggie. Vivian's telling everyone you've lost your mind, that you're bitter about being pushed out of the social circle." "Let them talk," Margaret replied, surprised at how little she cared about the gossip. "The house will be saved. That's what matters." That evening, as Margaret was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. James was still at the club, likely fielding questions about his wife's sudden activism. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer the door. Charlotte Richardson, Vivian's daughter and the bride-to-be, stood on the porch. She was a lovely young woman of 33, with her mother's elegant posture but a gentler expression. "Charlotte," Margaret said, genuinely surprised. "This is unexpected." "May I come in, Mrs. Sullivan? I'd like to speak with you." Margaret stepped aside, gesturing the young woman into the living room. Of course. Can I offer you something to drink? Tea, perhaps? No, thank you. This won't take long. Charlotte sat perched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've come about the wedding invitation. Margaret took a seat across from her. I see. Mother told me what happened, about your name being left off. Charlotte looked directly at Margaret, her expression earnest. I want you to know that I had nothing to do with that. I gave Mother the guest list with both your and Mr. Sullivan's names clearly indicated. Margaret felt a small wave of vindication but kept her expression neutral. I appreciate you telling me that, Charlotte. I'm here to give you this. Charlotte reached into her purse and pulled out a new envelope. The correct invitation, with both your names. Margaret took the envelope, opening it to find a beautifully printed invitation addressed to Mr. and Mrs. James Sullivan. Thank you, she said softly. That was very thoughtful of you. Charlotte hesitated, then continued. Mother also told me about what happened with the Robertson house this morning. She's quite upset. I imagine she is. She says you did it to get back at her, that it had nothing to do with historical preservation. Margaret considered her response carefully. The Robertson house deserves to be preserved, that's not in question, but your mother has been, let's say, overlooking me for many years now. The invitation was simply the most recent example. Charlotte nodded slowly. I suspected as much. Mother can be difficult when she feels challenged. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. A small smile flickered across Charlotte's face. I remember when you were president of the Historical Society. I was just a teenager, but I used to love the walking tours you organized. You made the old buildings come alive with your stories. The compliment touched Margaret more than she expected. Thank you, Charlotte. That's kind of you to say. Did you know that Michael and I are looking at houses in Willowbrook? We want to settle here after the wedding. Charlotte's expression grew thoughtful. I've always loved the older homes, actually. The character, the craftsmanship. We looked at a house on Elm Street, a Victorian with the most beautiful stained glass windows. The old Peterson Place. Margaret nodded. Built in 1892, those windows were imported from a studio in Chicago. Charlotte's eyes lit up. Yes, that's the one. The real estate agent didn't know anything about its history. Most people don't appreciate history until it's gone, Margaret said. That's why preservation is so important. Charlotte stood to leave. I should go. Mother's expecting me for dinner. She hesitated at the door. Mrs. Sullivan, regardless of what happened with the invitation, I would very much like you to come to my wedding. Both you and Mr. Sullivan. We wouldn't miss it, Margaret assured her. After Charlotte left, Margaret returned to the kitchen, the corrected invitation in hand. She should have felt triumphant, vindicated. Yet instead, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The slight had been acknowledged and corrected, but the underlying pattern remained. Vivian would continue to be Vivian, finding new ways to assert her social dominance. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Anthony Kerrigan, the developer. Mrs. Sullivan, his deep voice greeted her. I've had an interesting afternoon speaking with various people in your community. Your name seems to come up quite frequently. Does it? Margaret leaned against the counter, curious about where this conversation was heading. Indeed, some sing your praises as a tireless advocate for historical preservation. Others suggest you're staging a social comeback at the expense of my business deal. And what do you think, Mr. Kerrigan? He chuckled. I think you're a formidable woman who knows exactly what she's doing. My architects have been reviewing the Robertson house plans. They believe we can preserve the exterior and most of the significant interior elements while still creating a modern living space. The numbers actually work better than I expected. I'm glad to hear it. But here's where things get interesting, Mrs. Sullivan. In my conversations today, I learned about several other historically significant properties in Willowbrook that might benefit from similar treatment, renovation rather than demolition, historical designation rather than unchecked development. Margaret straightened, her full attention captured. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Kerrigan? A partnership of sorts, your knowledge of local history and preservation combined with my development resources. We identify properties with historical value that have fallen into disrepair, acquire them, restore the historical elements while modernizing the infrastructure, and market them as luxury heritage homes. Margaret was silent for a moment, considering the proposal. That's not what I expected from a developer who originally planned to demolish the Robertson house. I'm a businessman, Mrs. Sullivan. I follow the profits, and it appears there's a market for historical properties with modern amenities, especially with the tax benefits of landmark status. Why me? Margaret asked directly. There are younger preservationists in town. The current Historical Society Board. Don't have your reputation or expertise, Kerrigan interrupted. And frankly, after watching you outmaneuver everyone this morning, I'd rather have you as an ally than an opponent. Margaret couldn't help but smile at that. I'll need to think about it, Mr. Kerrigan. This isn't a decision I can make lightly. Of course, take your time. I'll be in town until Wednesday, meeting with the Robertsons and revising our purchase agreement. Perhaps we could meet for lunch tomorrow to discuss further. That would be acceptable. Noon at the Willowbrook Cafe? Perfect. I look forward to it, Mrs. Sullivan. After hanging up, Margaret stood motionless in her kitchen, mind racing with possibilities. A partnership with a developer? It was unexpected, perhaps even controversial among her preservation-minded colleagues. But the potential to save multiple historic properties, to have real influence over the changing landscape of Willowbrook was tempting. The sound of James's car in the driveway pulled her from her thoughts. She placed the corrected wedding invitation on the counter where he would see it and returned to preparing dinner. It's been quite a day, James announced as he entered, loosening his tie. Everyone at the club was talking about you and the Robertson house. Vivian was practically apoplectic. Was she? Margaret kept her tone neutral as she stirred the pasta sauce. Tommy Robertson was there too. Said you'd actually convinced the developer to consider renovation instead of demolition. Is that true? It is. Mr. Kerrigan called me this afternoon. His architects think the house can be preserved while still creating a modern living space. James shook his head in amazement. Well, I'll be damned. You actually pulled it off. He noticed the envelope on the counter. What's this? Charlotte Richardson came by earlier. She brought a corrected wedding invitation, with both our names. James picked up the envelope, examining the elegant script that now properly acknowledged his wife. Well, look at that. Seems Vivian had to back down after all. It was Charlotte's doing, not Vivian's. She told me she had included both our names on the original guest list. Ah. James set the invitation down. So Vivian deliberately left your name off. Yes. And that's why you went after the Robertson house, to show her you still had influence. Margaret turned to face her husband, wooden spoon in hand. I went after the Robertson house because it's a historically significant building that deserves to be preserved. The fact that it disrupted Vivian's social machinations was an added benefit. James studied his wife's face, then slowly smiled. You know, Maggie, I've always known you were formidable, but today you reminded the whole town. Including me. He stepped forward and kissed her cheek. It suits you. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the stove. After decades of marriage, James still had moments when he truly saw her. Mr. Kerrigan has proposed a partnership, she said, turning back to the sauce, to identify and restore other historic properties in Willowbrook. A partnership? With you? James sounded surprised. Is that so hard to believe? I do have expertise in this area. No, it's not that, it's just. James paused. What would this partnership entail? We're meeting tomorrow to discuss details, but essentially, I would identify properties with historical value. He would acquire and restore them, and we would market them as luxury heritage homes. Sounds like quite an undertaking, especially for someone who's supposedly retired. Margaret gave the sauce a final stir and turned off the heat. Perhaps I'm not as ready for retirement as everyone seems to think. That night, as they prepared for bed, James watched his wife with newfound curiosity. You've been unhappy, haven't you, these past few years? Margaret paused in the middle of removing her earrings. Not unhappy, exactly. More, invisible. As if all those years of work for this community simply faded away, and with them, my relevance. And today made you visible again. Yes, she met his eyes in the mirror. It felt good, James, to be taken seriously, to make a difference. He nodded slowly. Then you should meet with this developer, see what comes of it. You wouldn't mind if I took on something new at our age? James chuckled. Maggie, in 43 years of marriage, I've learned one thing for certain. You're at your best when you have a purpose. And honestly, you're a bit terrifying when you're bored. Margaret laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. Well, we can't have that, can we? The next morning, Margaret woke with a renewed sense of energy. She dressed carefully for her meeting with Kerrigan, choosing a tailored blazer and silk scarf that projected both professionalism and confidence. As she was about to leave, the phone rang. It was Henry Watkins. Margaret, have you seen this morning's Willowbrook Gazette? No, why? There's a letter to the editor from Vivian Richardson about you and the Robertson house. It's not flattering. Margaret sighed. I'm not surprised. What does it say? She's accusing you of using the landmark designation process for personal vendettas, says you're undermining property rights and community progress to settle old scores. Is that all? Henry hesitated. She also suggests that you manipulated the Historical Society Board because of our, how did she put it? Sentimental attachment to a bygone era and its self-appointed guardian. Despite herself, Margaret laughed. Well, she's not entirely wrong about the sentimental attachment part. This isn't funny, Margaret. She's trying to rally public opinion against the landmark designation before the full review. Let her try, Margaret replied, surprising herself with her own confidence. The facts are on our side. The Robertson house meets all the criteria for historical significance. Still, we should prepare a response, perhaps a public meeting to explain the importance of preservation. That's an excellent idea, Henry. Can you organize it? Perhaps for next week, after I've had a chance to meet with Mr. Kerrigan and understand his renovation plans better. Kerrigan? You're meeting with him? Yes, today at noon. He's considering a renovation approach rather than demolition. Henry sounded relieved. That's excellent news. If the developer is on board, Vivian's opposition will seem purely personal. Which it is, Margaret noted dryly. After hanging up, Margaret checked her watch. She still had time to pick up the latest Gazette before her meeting with Kerrigan. The newspaper stand outside the local pharmacy had the headline clearly visible, Historical Designation Halts Major Property Sale. Margaret purchased a copy and flipped to the opinion section, where Vivian's letter was prominently displayed. Community progress held hostage by personal vendetta, the headline proclaimed. The letter itself was a masterpiece of insinuation and selective facts, painting Margaret as a bitter relic of the past, desperately clinging to influence by any means necessary. Margaret folded the paper and tucked it into her purse. Vivian's tactics were predictable. When challenged directly, she always resorted to public attacks designed to isolate and discredit her opponent. It had worked in the past because Margaret had always chosen to take the high road, to withdraw rather than engage in public conflict. Not this time. At precisely noon, Margaret entered the Willowbrook Cafe. Anthony Kerrigan was already seated at a corner table, his imposing figure distinct even in the crowded lunchtime rush. He stood as she approached, extending his hand. "Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for joining me." Up close, Kerrigan was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and keen gray eyes. His handshake was firm, his manner direct. "Mr. Kerrigan," Margaret took the offered seat. "I must admit I'm curious about this partnership you've proposed." "Straight to business, I appreciate that," Kerrigan smiled. "Before we begin, I should mention that I've seen this morning's newspaper. Vivian Richardson seems quite determined to discredit you." "Vivian has been trying to discredit me for nearly 3 decades, Margaret replied calmly. "She's never quite succeeded." Kerrigan's smile widened. "I can see why. You don't intimidate easily." "Not anymore, no." They ordered lunch, a Cobb salad for Margaret, a steak sandwich for Kerrigan, and spent the next hour discussing his proposal in detail. Kerrigan had already identified 3 other properties in Willowbrook that might benefit from historical renovation. He needed Margaret's expertise to navigate the landmark designation process, her knowledge of local history to authenticate period details, and her community connections to smooth the way for permits and approvals. "What you're describing would essentially be a full-time commitment," Margaret observed as coffee was served. "I'm not sure I'm looking for that level of involvement." "Consider it a consultancy then," Kerrigan suggested. "You set the terms, the hours, the compensation, the level of public association with the projects." Margaret stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Why Willowbrook? There are larger communities with more historic properties within an hour's drive of Chicago. Frankly, less competition, lower acquisition costs, and a community that already values its historical character. It's the perfect testing ground for this business model. And if it works here, you'll expand to other communities." Kerrigan nodded. "Exactly. Heritage luxury homes are an untapped market in this region. Modern amenities with historical cachet, the best of both worlds." "And what happens when you've restored all the viable properties in Willowbrook? You move on, and I'm left with what exactly?" "A percentage of ongoing profits from properties you help develop, a consulting role in the expanded business if you want it, and a community with preserved historical buildings that might otherwise have been demolished." Kerrigan leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to trust me, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm proposing a business arrangement that benefits us both while achieving your preservation goals." Margaret had to admit the proposal was tempting. It offered not just a chance to save historical buildings, but to have a direct hand in shaping Willowbrook's future development. And the financial aspect wasn't insignificant. Not that she and James needed the money, but having her own independent income again was appealing. "I'll need to see the specifics in writing," she said finally. "A formal proposal with clear terms." "Of course. I'll have my lawyer draft something this afternoon." Kerrigan checked his watch. "Speaking of which, I should be going. I have a meeting with the Robertsons at 2 to discuss the revised purchase agreement." As they stood to leave, Kerrigan added, "One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan. The petition you filed for the Robertson house, I assume you're prepared to support it at the landmark review hearing." "Absolutely. The house meets all the historical criteria." "Good, because I suspect Vivian Richardson won't be giving up her opposition so easily." Margaret smiled. "Mr. Kerrigan, I've been dealing with Vivian Richardson since before you built your first development. I can handle whatever she throws my way." As Margaret walked home from the cafe, she noticed people watching her, some nodding in recognition, others whispering as she passed. Vivian's letter had clearly made an impact, but not necessarily the one intended. There was a new respect in some of those glances, a curiosity that hadn't been there before. She had just turned onto her street when a car pulled up beside her. Betty Robertson rolled down the window. "Margaret, I've been trying to reach you all morning." Margaret stopped, surprised by the woman's animated expression. "Hello, Betty. Is everything all right?" "More than all right. We just finished meeting with Mr. Kerrigan. The new offer is even better than the original. More money, and we get to keep living in the house for 6 months while our new condo is being finished." "That's wonderful news, Betty. I'm glad it's working out." Betty's expression turned serious. "I owe you an apology, Margaret. When this all started yesterday, I was furious. I thought you were ruining our retirement plans. But Tommy showed me the information about landmark status, and then Mr. Kerrigan explained his new vision for the house." She shook her head in wonder. "It's going to be beautiful, Margaret. They're keeping all the original woodwork, the stained glass in the dining room, even the built-in cabinets I've always loved." Margaret felt a wave of satisfaction. "I'm so pleased to hear that, Betty. Anyway, I wanted you to know that Tommy and I aren't upset anymore, and we don't agree with what Vivian wrote in the paper. It was spiteful and unfair." "Thank you for telling me that. It means a lot." As Betty drove away, Margaret continued home with a lighter step. One battle won, but the war with Vivian was far from over. Still, for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive, engaged in something meaningful that drew on her expertise and passion. James was waiting when she arrived home, an unusual occurrence for mid-afternoon on a weekday. "How was your meeting?" he asked without preamble. "Productive. Kerrigan is sending over a formal proposal later today." Margaret hung up her coat. "Why are you home so early?" James hesitated. "I had an interesting conversation with Richard Harper at the club today." Richard Harper was the president of Willowbrook National Bank, where the Sullivans had done their banking for decades. "Oh, what about?" "About you, actually, and a new historical renovation investment fund he's considering launching." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "Really? That's quite a coincidence." "Not a coincidence at all. Apparently, Anthony Kerrigan had breakfast with him this morning before your lunch meeting. Pitched the whole historical renovation concept as an investment opportunity for the bank's wealth management clients." "I see." Margaret sat down slowly, processing this new information. "And what did Richard think of the idea?" "He's intrigued, wants to know if you'd be involved given your historical expertise." James studied his wife's face. "Kerrigan's moving fast, Maggie. Setting up financial backing before you've even agreed to the partnership." "That's just good business," Margaret replied, though she was troubled by the revelation. "He needs investors whether I'm involved or not." "Maybe, but he's using your name, your reputation to open doors. Richard seemed to think your involvement was a given." Margaret frowned. "I made no commitments to Kerrigan. We discussed possibilities, that's all." "Well, you might want to clarify that when his proposal arrives. Make sure he's not presuming too much." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. A courier stood on the porch with an envelope from Kerrigan Development. Margaret brought the document to the kitchen table where she and James read through it together. The proposal was comprehensive, a 3-year partnership agreement with clear terms for Margaret's role as historical authentication consultant, compensation structure, profit-sharing arrangements, and explicit language about which properties would be targeted for acquisition and renovation. "This is more detailed than I expected for a first draft," Margaret commented, flipping through the pages. "And more committed," James added, pointing to a clause. "Look here. Initial capital investment of $5 million, secured through Willowbrook National Bank's Heritage Investment Fund. That fund doesn't even exist yet, according to Richard." Margaret sat back, a mixture of irritation and admiration washing over her. He's creating momentum, making it seem inevitable so people will jump on board. Classic developer tactic. James agreed. The question is, do you want to be part of it? Before Margaret could respond, the phone rang. It was Henry Watkins again. Margaret, we've got trouble. Vivian has called an emergency meeting of the City Council for tomorrow morning. She's proposing an amendment to the landmark designation process that would require property owner consent before any petition could be filed. She can't do that. It would undermine the entire preservation system. She's got 3 council members supporting her already. If it passes, it would invalidate the Robertson petition retroactively. Margaret's mind raced. We need to rally support immediately. Call everyone from the Historical Society. I'll reach out to the Architectural Preservation Alliance in the city. They've helped us before with legislative challenges. Already on it. But Margaret, we need you to speak at the meeting. You're the most knowledgeable about both the legal and historical aspects. Of course I'll speak. What time? 9 a.m. City Hall chambers. After hanging up, Margaret turned to James, determination hardening her features. Vivian is trying to change the landmark designation rules to invalidate the Robertson petition. James whistled low. She's not holding back, is she? No, and neither will I. Margaret picked up the phone again. I need to call Anthony Kerrigan. If he's serious about this partnership, he just got his first test. Kerrigan answered on the second ring. Mrs. Sullivan, I trust you received my proposal? I did, Mr. Kerrigan, but we have a more immediate concern. Vivian Richardson has called an emergency city council meeting for tomorrow morning to amend the landmark designation process. If her amendment passes, it would invalidate the Robertson petition and undermine our entire partnership concept. There was a brief silence. I see. What do you need from me? Your presence at the meeting, for one. As the buyer of the Robertson house, your support for the landmark designation would be powerful, and any connections you might have with city council members. I only just arrived in town, Mrs. Sullivan. I don't have many local political connections yet. But you've been busy making other connections, haven't you? Breakfast with Richard Harper, floating the idea of a heritage investment fund. Kerrigan chuckled. You're well informed. This is my community, Mr. Kerrigan. Little happens here without my knowledge. Point taken. Yes, I'll attend the meeting. And while I may not have political connections yet, I do have economic arguments that council members might find persuasive. Historical renovation projects create jobs, increase property values, and generate tax revenue. Good. We'll need every advantage. Margaret paused. One more thing, Mr. Kerrigan. In the future, I'd appreciate if you didn't use my name or implied my involvement in your business discussions until we have a formal agreement. Harper mentioned our conversation. Kerrigan sounded more amused than contrite. My apologies if I overstepped. I was simply laying groundwork. Understood. But to be clear, I haven't agreed to anything yet, and how you handle tomorrow's meeting will significantly influence my decision. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of phone calls and preparation. Margaret reached out to her contacts in the Architectural Preservation Alliance, who promised to send a representative to the council meeting. Henry organized the Historical Society members, assigning each person specific council members to contact before the vote. By evening, Margaret had prepared her statement for the meeting and assembled a folder of documentation on the historical significance of the Robertson house. As she and James prepared for bed that night, he asked, "Are you ready for tomorrow?" "As ready as I can be," Margaret replied, setting her alarm clock. "It's been a while since I've done battle in the political arena, but some skills never fade." "Vivian won't know what hit her," James said with confidence. "Just like the old days, when you used to run circles around the town council on the library funding issues." Margaret smiled at the memory. Those were simpler times. The stakes seem higher now. The stakes, or your determination? Perhaps both. Margaret turned off her bedside lamp. When Vivian left my name off that invitation, It was as if she was erasing me, my identity, my contributions, my very existence in this community. I don't think I fully realized until that moment how much that pattern of erasure had affected me over the years. James reached for her hand in the darkness. For what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't notice it happening, or how much it hurt you. You're noticing now, Margaret replied softly. That counts for something. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Margaret dressed in her most professional outfit, a navy suit with a silk blouse and her mother's pearl earrings. As she fastened them, she thought about the generations of women in her family who had fought their own battles for recognition and respect. Her grandmother had been one of the first female voters in Illinois. Her mother had run a business when most women stayed home. And now here she was, at 68, fighting for her community's heritage and her own place within it. The City Hall chambers were already crowded when Margaret and James arrived at 8:45. Historical Society members had turned out in force, as had a contingent of supporters rallied by Vivian, mostly younger residents and business owners who favored development over preservation. The atmosphere was tense, with sharply divided groups eyeing each other across the aisle. Henry Watkins waved Margaret over to a seat he'd saved in the front row. "We've been working the council all morning," he whispered. "It's going to be close. 4 firmly against the amendment, 3 firmly for it, and 2 undecided." Margaret nodded, scanning the room. "Is Kerrigan here?" "Not yet. But the meeting doesn't start for another 10 minutes. At precisely 9 o'clock, Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order. "We're here to consider an emergency amendment to Municipal Code Section 12.7 regarding the process for historical landmark designation. Councilwoman Richardson has proposed the amendment and will speak first." Vivian Richardson rose from her council seat, immaculately dressed as always in a designer suit, not a hair out of place. "Thank you, Mayor Wilson. Fellow council members, citizens of Willowbrook, I come before you today with grave concerns about our current landmark designation process. As it stands, this process allows any group or individual to file a petition that can significantly restrict a property owner's rights without their consent or input." She paused for effect, her gaze sweeping the room before settling briefly on Margaret. Recent events have highlighted how this process can be manipulated for personal agendas rather than genuine historical preservation. The amendment I'm proposing simply requires property owner consent before a landmark petition can be filed. This reasonable safeguard would protect property rights while still allowing for preservation of truly significant buildings where owners are willing participants. As Vivian continued outlining her amendment, Margaret noticed Anthony Kerrigan slip into the chamber. He nodded to her briefly before taking a seat on the opposite side of the aisle, not with Vivian's supporters, but not with the Historical Society group either. His positioning was deliberate, Margaret realized. He was waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing himself. After Vivian concluded her presentation, Mayor Wilson called for public comment. "We'll alternate between supporters and opponents of the amendment. First, we'll hear from Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, representing the Historical Society." Margaret approached the podium, setting her notes before her but maintaining eye contact with the council members. "Mayor Wilson, council members, thank you for the opportunity to address this critical issue. The landmark designation process, as currently structured, has served Willowbrook effectively for 25 years. It has preserved our community's architectural heritage while allowing for thoughtful development and growth." She continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "The proposed amendment would fundamentally undermine this balance. Throughout history, the most significant threat to historical preservation has been short-term economic interest. If property owner consent were required for landmark designation, many irreplaceable buildings would be lost before their historical value could be properly assessed and appreciated." Margaret gestured to the chamber around them. "This very building, Willowbrook City Hall, was saved from demolition in 1979 through an emergency landmark petition filed against the wishes of its then owner, who wanted to sell to a hotel developer. Today, it stands as the heart of our civic life, a testament to the foresight of those who recognized its value beyond mere real estate. For the next 5 minutes, Margaret methodically dismantled Vivian's arguments, citing legal precedents, economic studies on the positive impact of historical preservation on property values, and specific examples from Willowbrook's own history. She concluded by addressing the elephant in the room. Some have suggested that the recent petition regarding the Robertson House was motivated by personal factors rather than historical merit. I invite any council member to review the extensive documentation we've submitted on the architectural and historical significance of this property. The facts speak for themselves. This house meets every criterion for landmark status under our current code. Margaret returned to her seat amid applause from the Historical Society supporters. James squeezed her hand in silent congratulation. The next speaker was Betty Robertson, which surprised Margaret. Betty approached the podium nervously. "I'm not used to speaking at these meetings," she began hesitantly, "but I felt I needed to say something since our house is at the center of this debate. When the landmark petition was first filed, Tommy and I were upset. We thought our retirement plans were being derailed. But after learning more about what landmark status actually means, and after meeting with Mr. Kerrigan about his new renovation plans instead of demolition, well, we've changed our minds." Betty straightened, gaining confidence. "The changes Mr. Kerrigan is proposing will preserve all the historical features we've loved about our home, while updating the parts that needed modernizing anyway. And the value of our property has actually increased because of its historical significance. So while we might have opposed this petition initially, we now support it fully." Vivian looked thunderstruck as Betty returned to her seat. This testimonial from the very property owners whose rights she claimed to be protecting severely undermined her position. Speaker after speaker approached the podium, alternating between those supporting and opposing the amendment. The chamber grew warm as the meeting stretched past the 1-hour mark. Finally, Mayor Wilson called on Anthony Kerrigan. Kerrigan approached the podium with confident ease. "Mayor Wilson, council members, citizens of Willowbrook. My name is Anthony Kerrigan, CEO of Kerrigan Development, and the prospective buyer of the Robertson property that has been the catalyst for today's discussion." He paused, allowing his status to register with the council. "I came to Willowbrook looking for development opportunities, specifically properties to acquire, demolish, and rebuild as contemporary homes. That was my business model, and it's been profitable in other communities." Kerrigan leaned slightly forward. "But my experience here has been educational, thanks to the landmark petition filed by Mrs. Pressing, Sullivan, and the Historical Society. I was forced to reconsider my approach to the Robertson property. What I initially viewed as an obstacle has become an opportunity, a chance to create something of greater value by preserving historical elements while incorporating modern amenities." He turned slightly, including both sides of the divided chamber in his gaze. Based on this experience, Kerrigan Development is now exploring a broader initiative focused on historical renovation throughout Willowbrook. This approach would preserve architectural heritage while creating jobs, increasing property values, and generating tax revenue. But, and this is critical, such an initiative depends on a robust landmark designation process that can identify and protect historically significant properties before they're lost to demolition. Kerrigan's voice hardened slightly. The proposed amendment would effectively gut this process. It would allow short-term economic interests to permanently erase irreplaceable historical assets. As a developer who has come to appreciate the value of Willowbrook's architectural heritage, I strongly urge the Council to reject this amendment and maintain the current landmark designation process that has served your community so well. As Kerrigan returned to his seat, Margaret caught his eye. He gave her a slight nod and she returned it with newfound respect. He had just publicly aligned himself with her position, potentially burning bridges with Vivian and her supporters. It was a calculated risk, but one that spoke to his commitment to their potential partnership. After all public comments concluded, Mayor Wilson called for council discussion. The debate was spirited, with council members on both sides making impassioned arguments. Throughout the discussion, Vivian kept shooting venomous glances at Margaret, her composure gradually cracking as it became clear the tide was turning against her amendment. Finally, Mayor Wilson called for a vote. All in favor of the proposed amendment to Municipal Code Section 12.7, requiring property owner consent for landmark designation petitions, please signify by raising your hand. 3 hands went up, Vivian and her 2 most reliable allies. All opposed? 6 hands rose decisively. The amendment is defeated by a vote of 6-3. A cheer went up from the Historical Society supporters. Margaret remained seated, accepting congratulations from those around her with quiet dignity. This wasn't just a victory for historical preservation. It was a public rejection of Vivian's attempt to use the political process for her personal vendetta. As the meeting adjourned, Margaret made her way through the crowd toward Kerrigan. "Thank you for your support, Mr. Kerrigan. Your testimony was particularly effective." "I meant every word," he replied. "Though I admit, the business potential helped align my principles with my interests." "A fortunate convergence," Margaret acknowledged with a small smile. "About your proposal, I'd like to discuss some modifications before moving forward." "I'm all ears, Mrs. Sullivan." "Not here. Tomorrow morning at my house. 10 o'clock? I'll be there." As Kerrigan moved away, Margaret felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Vivian standing there, her expression a mixture of fury and forced composure. "Congratulations, Margaret," Vivian said, her voice tight. "You've won this round." "This wasn't about winning, Vivian. It was about doing what's right for Willowbrook." "Please, we both know what this was about." Vivian leaned closer. "You couldn't stand being sidelined, forgotten. So you manufactured this entire situation to make yourself relevant again." Margaret met her gaze steadily. "Is that what you think? That I orchestrated a developer buying the Robertson house, planning to demolish it just so I could file a landmark petition and get your attention?" "Don't be absurd. But you seized on the situation to reassert yourself, to remind everyone that Margaret Sullivan still matters." "And is that so terrible, Vivian? To want to be acknowledged for one's contributions? To not be erased from invitations or community recognition?" Vivian's expression faltered slightly. "That invitation was a simple oversight." "No, it wasn't. Just as it wasn't an oversight when you left my name off the Historical Society plaque after 10 years of service. Or when you forgot to include me in the Ladies' League anniversary celebration despite my founding membership. It's been a pattern, Vivian. For years." For a moment, something like recognition flickered in Vivian's eyes. Then her mask of disdain returned. "You've made your point, Margaret. Enjoy your moment in the spotlight. It won't last." As Vivian walked away, Charlotte approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I just wanted to say, that was impressive, what you did today." "Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you again for the corrected invitation." Charlotte glanced at her mother's retreating back. "She won't admit it, but she respects you. That's why she works so hard to diminish you. You're the only one she sees as real competition." Margaret considered this insight from the younger woman. Perhaps, though competition implies we're playing the same game, I'm not sure we ever were. "Maybe not, but your game seems more worthwhile." Charlotte smiled. "I should go, but I meant what I said before. I really hope you'll come to the wedding. We wouldn't miss it." The following morning, Margaret prepared for her meeting with Kerrigan with renewed purpose. She had spent the evening reviewing his proposal and making notes on modifications she wanted to suggest. James had left early for a golf game, giving her space to focus. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Anthony Kerrigan stood on her porch, briefcase in hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan." "Good morning, Mr. Kerrigan. Please come in. Would you like coffee?" "That would be welcome, thank you." Margaret led him to the kitchen, where she had prepared coffee and a plate of homemade cinnamon rolls. As she poured the coffee, Kerrigan glanced around appreciatively. "Beautiful woodwork in this house. 1920s?" 1922, Margaret confirmed. "We've restored much of it ourselves over the years." They settled at the kitchen table, their proposal between them. "I've reviewed your terms," Margaret began, "and I'm interested in moving forward with some modifications." "I expected nothing less," Kerrigan replied. "What changes did you have in mind?" For the next hour, they negotiated specifics: her time commitment, compensation structure, and most importantly, the selection criteria for properties. Margaret insisted on a clause giving her veto power over any acquisition that didn't meet strict historical significance standards. "I won't be associated with projects that compromise historical integrity for profit," she stated firmly. "The Robertson House works because it has genuine historical value. That needs to be our standard going forward." Kerrigan considered this, then nodded. "Agreed. Quality over quantity. It aligns with the premium market positioning anyway." By noon, they had reached agreement on all major points. Kerrigan would have his lawyer draft a revised contract for her review. "One last thing," Margaret said as they concluded. "I'd like our first official project after the Robertson House to be the Peterson Victorian on Elm Street. The one Charlotte Richardson and her fiancé were considering." Kerrigan raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason?" "It's architecturally significant and has been neglected for years. The current owner is elderly and can't maintain it properly. And," Margaret smiled slightly, "I think it would make a perfect wedding gift from me to Charlotte. Not the entire house, of course, but perhaps a renovation fund to help them purchase and restore it properly." A generous gesture, and a strategic one. Kerrigan's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Showing Vivian Richardson that you can be both formidable and gracious in victory." "Something like that." Margaret extended her hand. "Do we have a deal, Mr. Kerrigan?" He shook it firmly. "We do indeed, Mrs. Sullivan. I think this is the beginning of a very productive partnership." After Kerrigan left, Margaret sat quietly at her kitchen table, reflecting on the whirlwind events of the past few days. From the slight of the wedding invitation to this new professional venture, it was as if a door had opened to a chapter of her life she hadn't realized was waiting to be written. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Emily. "Mom, I just heard from Charlotte Richardson about what happened at the city council meeting yesterday. And now there's some rumor going around about you partnering with a developer. What's going on?" Margaret smiled. "It's a long story, dear. Why don't you come for dinner tonight and I'll tell you all about it." "Okay, but, Mom, are you all right? This doesn't sound like you." "On the contrary, Emily, it sounds exactly like me. The me I've always been, but perhaps forgotten for a while." After hanging up, Margaret went to her desk and pulled out the corrected wedding invitation. She wrote a brief, elegant acceptance note, addressing it to both Charlotte and her fiancé. Then she added a personal postscript. "Charlotte, I would be honored if you and Michael would allow me to show you the historical features of the Peterson House on Elm Street before you make your final decision on a home. Some treasures, once lost, can never be replaced, but with care and respect, they can be renewed for generations to come. Warmly, Margaret Sullivan." She sealed the envelope, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The invitation slight that had sparked this journey had been more than corrected. It had been transformed into an opportunity for renewal, not just for a historic house, but for Margaret herself. As she placed the response card in her mailbox and raised the flag, Margaret noticed Vivian Richardson driving slowly past her house. Their eyes met briefly, and Margaret nodded in acknowledgement. Not in triumph or smugness, but in recognition of their shared history, their differences, and perhaps, someday, a mutual respect born of understanding that some battles are about more than winning or losing. They're about being seen, heard, and valued for who you truly are. Margaret turned back toward her house, shoulders straight, steps purposeful. At 68, she wasn't finished making her mark on Willowbrook. In fact, she was just getting started. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood beside James in the garden at Meadowview, watching as Charlotte Richardson processed down the aisle on her father's arm. The historic estate had never looked more beautiful, with spring flowers in full bloom and the restored 19th century mansion gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The ceremony was elegant but heartfelt. As Charlotte and Michael exchanged vows, Margaret found herself reflecting on her own marriage, 43 years of partnership that had weathered many changes. James squeezed her hand as if reading her thoughts, and she returned the pressure gratefully. At the reception, they found their place cards at a table near the front. Not at the family table, of course, but at an honored position nonetheless. Mr. and Mrs. James Sullivan, both names clearly printed in elegant script. Vivian approached as they were being seated, her hostess smile firmly in place. "James, Margaret, so glad you could come." "Wouldn't have missed it," James replied warmly. "Beautiful ceremony." "Charlotte looks radiant," Margaret added sincerely. "You must be very proud." "I am." For a moment, Vivian's polished veneer softened. "She told me about your offer to show them the Peterson house. That was kind of you. It's a special property. It deserves owners who will appreciate its history." Vivian nodded, something unspoken passing between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a truce. "I heard about your partnership with Kerrigan. Quite the career revival at your age." Margaret smiled, refusing to take offense at the age reference. "It's less a revival than a continuation, Vivian. Some of us never stopped having something to contribute." "Evidently not." Vivian glanced around as more guests arrived. "I should continue greeting people. Enjoy the reception." As she moved away, James leaned closer to Margaret. "Well, that was almost civil." "Progress, I suppose," Margaret replied. "Though I don't expect Christmas cards anytime soon." The evening progressed pleasantly. The food was excellent, the band played classic standards that Margaret and James could dance to, and several old friends stopped by their table to catch up, many mentioning they'd heard about Margaret's new venture with Kerrigan Development. "You're becoming quite the talk of the town again," Henry Watkins commented as he and his wife joined them briefly. The Historical Society has received 3 new membership applications this week, all citing the Robertson House preservation as their inspiration. "That's wonderful, Henry. New blood is exactly what the society needs." As the celebration continued, Charlotte and Michael made their rounds, stopping at Margaret and James's table for longer than mere courtesy required. "Mrs. Sullivan," Charlotte said warmly, "Michael and I wanted to thank you personally for the renovation fund offer. We visited the Peterson house yesterday, and you were right. Those stained glass windows are extraordinary." "Have you made a decision?" Margaret asked. Michael nodded, his arm around his new wife's waist. "We're making an offer tomorrow. Your partnership with Mr. Plays. Kerrigan gave us the confidence that we could tackle a restoration project like this." "I'm so pleased," Margaret said sincerely. "That house has been waiting for the right family." After the newlyweds moved on, James turned to his wife with admiration in his eyes. "You know, Maggie, in all our years together, I don't think I've ever been prouder of you than I have these past few weeks. Even though I caused quite the stir?" "Because you caused quite the stir. The right kind of stir." He took her hand. You reminded me, and everyone else, of the remarkable woman I married. Not just supportive and kind, but formidable in your own right. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the champagne. Thank you, James. That means more than you know. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret found herself on the terrace, taking a moment of quiet amid the festivities. The lights of Willowbrook spread out below Meadowview's hillside location, a tapestry of past and present intertwined. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Charlotte approaching, her wedding gown gleaming in the soft lighting. Taking a break from your adoring public? Margaret asked with a smile. Something like that. Charlotte leaned against the terrace railing beside her. Mother is in full hostess mode, making sure everyone knows exactly how much everything cost and which celebrity she had to turn down for the venue. Margaret chuckled. Some things never change. And some things do. Charlotte looked at Margaret thoughtfully. Like you, everyone's talking about how you stood up to Mother and saved the Robertson house. And now this partnership with Miss Kerrigan, you've become something of an inspiration. At my age, how flattering. Age has nothing to do with it. Charlotte's expression was earnest. It's about standing your ground, knowing your worth, not letting yourself be diminished or erased. That's timeless. Margaret was touched by the young woman's perception. Thank you, Charlotte. That's very kind. It's not kindness, it's admiration. Charlotte smiled ruefully. Growing up with my mother wasn't always easy. Watching another woman refuse to be overshadowed by her. It means something to me. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the lights of the town below. Then Charlotte spoke again, her voice softer. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Sullivan? Something personal? Of course. How do you do it? Stand firm without becoming bitter. Mother has been, well, mother for decades, yet you've maintained your dignity, your purpose. Margaret considered the question carefully. I think the key is remembering that other people's attempts to diminish you reflect their insecurities, not your worth. And finding purpose beyond social standing, something meaningful that draws on your unique strengths, like saving historical buildings. For me, yes. For you, it might be something entirely different. Margaret turned to face the bride. What matters is that it's authentic to who you are, not who others expect you to be. Charlotte nodded slowly, absorbing the words. I think that's why Michael and I are so drawn to the Peterson house. It's not what Mother would choose for us. She's been pushing new construction in the country club neighborhood. But there's something about preserving something with history, with character. That resonates with your own values, Margaret finished for her. Trust that instinct, Charlotte. It will serve you well. The sound of the band starting up again drifted through the open doors. I should get back, Charlotte said reluctantly. First dance with my father coming up. Of course. Go enjoy your celebration. You've created a beautiful beginning. As Charlotte turned to leave, she impulsively leaned forward and hugged Margaret. Thank you for everything. Watching the young woman return to her wedding reception, Margaret felt a sense of completion. What had begun as a slight, her name omitted from an invitation, had evolved into something far more significant. Not just the preservation of a historical home or the launch of a new professional venture, but perhaps the beginning of a mentorship that could influence the next generation. James appeared in the doorway. There you are. I've been looking for you. Ready to head home? Margaret took one last look at the lights of Willowbrook, the town she had served and loved for decades. Yes, I'm ready. But James? Tomorrow, let's visit that craftsman on Maple Avenue that's been on the market for months. I have some ideas for it that Kerrigan should hear. James laughed, offering his arm. Already planning the next project? You're unstoppable, Maggie. No, she corrected him gently, taking his arm. Not unstoppable, just not finished yet. As they walked to their car, Margaret reflected that some battles weren't really about winning or losing, they were about reclaiming your voice when others tried to silence it. About refusing to be erased, even as you aged. About reminding yourself and everyone else that wisdom and experience weren't liabilities but assets. That a woman in her 60s could still shape her community, mentor the next generation, and write new chapters in her own story. They had taken her name off the wedding invitation, but in the process, they had inadvertently given her something far more valuable, the push she needed to take her rightful place back in the community she loved. Not as someone's wife or guest, but as Margaret Sullivan, preservationist, businesswoman, and force to be reckoned with. And for that, ironically, she had Vivian Richardson to thank.